From the Presidential Palace, Manila, Dateline Malacañang.
Good day, this is Dateline Malacañang, and here are the news. Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. delivers an arrival statement after his successful participation in the 47th Association of Southeast Asian Nations or ASEAN Summit and related summits in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia from October 26 to October 28. In a video message, the President emphasizes the summit as a key platform for fellow ASEAN leaders to continue strengthening partnerships that foster peace, stability, and economic progress across the region. He also reaffirms the country's unyielding commitment to advancing the Philippines' bilateral relations with dialogue partners and discusses cooperation across many fields of mutual interest, including security and defense, maritime affairs, climate action, trade and investment, agriculture, and people-to-people relations.
I have just attended the 47th ASEAN Summit and related summits in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The summit was once again an opportunity to discuss among our fellow ASEAN member states and partners how to navigate our future together amidst the various geopolitical and economic challenges that we face domestically, bilaterally, regionally, and globally. We discussed significant international issues, that emerging challenges that not only impact our peoples and our nation, but also the entire region, especially the West Philippine Sea. I reaffirm that the Philippines will continue to remain firm, calm, and resolute in defending our sovereignty, our sovereign rights, and jurisdiction in the West Philippine Sea, in accordance with, of course, international law. We will continue to strengthen our partnerships with all countries who share our values and our commitment to peace, to stability, and to economic progress. The leaders and I also discussed the ongoing situation in Myanmar and the implementation of the 5-point consensus to bring about a peaceful and lasting solution, which is Myanmar-owned and Myanmar-led. During this past 47th summit, we welcomed the full accession of Timor-Leste as the 11th member of ASEAN. This is a historic step that reaffirms ASEAN's commitment to unity and inclusivity. We remain committed to pursuing initiatives that will support Timor-Leste's capacity to assume its obligations as a full member of ASEAN, with the end goal of further building a people-centered ASEAN. The leaders and I spoke about future-proofing our region through economic cooperation and sustainable growth. We heard discussions from the IMF, from the BRICS group, from G20, amongst others. We reaffirmed ASEAN's collective commitment to rules-based, open, inclusive, transparent, and non-discriminatory multilateral system. We strengthened our trade with external partners with upgrades in the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, amendments in our free trade agreements, and utilization of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. At a time when the rules-based trading system faces significant challenges, these agreements will provide transparency, stability, and predictability, key foundations for building confidence among businesses and investors, and for sustaining ASEAN's role as a driver of regional and global growth. This economic development goes hand in hand with strengthening the socio-cultural community. We discussed the progress achieved and the actions moving forward for the environment, climate change, education, green jobs, and health. During this summit, the ASEAN leaders and I met with our counterparts from the United States, from Japan, India, China, the Republic of Korea, the United Nations, New Zealand, Australia. I highlighted the progress of our dialogue partnerships and how we envision the way forward together. On the sidelines of the summit, I met leaders and discussed ways to further strengthen our partnerships and expand cooperation in strategic areas. I met with the leaders of Cambodia, Canada, Thailand, Japan, the EU, Vietnam, Australia, New Zealand, and with the United Nations Secretary General. We reaffirmed our commitment to deepen bilateral relations and discussed cooperation on many fields of mutual interest, Fields such as security and defense, maritime, climate action, trade, investment, agriculture, and people-to-people relations. And I thank them for expressing their support for our ASEAN chairship in 2026. The Philippine delegation and I are grateful to Malaysia, the chair of ASEAN this year, and our generous host for the successful 47th ASEAN Summit and related summits and 2025 chairship of ASEAN. During the closing ceremony of the summits, Malaysia turned over the ASEAN chairship to us. As the 2026 chair of ASEAN, the Philippines looks forward to building on the gains of Malaysia's inclusivity and sustainability theme and carry ASEAN forward as we, as is our theme, navigate our future together.
President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. formally accepted the Philippines' role as chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, for 2026. Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim turned over the ASEAN chairship gavel to President Marcos during the closing ceremony of the 47th ASEAN Summit and related summits at Kuala Lumpur Convention Center in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. President Marcos said the Philippines will push for inclusive initiatives to strengthen and empower the region's security, economy, and people amid an increasingly evolving regional landscape. These main priorities, President Marcos said, will serve as Manila's compass in driving ASEAN toward a future where peace, prosperity, and people remain at the heart of all that we say and we do. The Philippines, as 2026 ASEAN chair, he said, will implement the ASEAN Community Vision 2045 in its first year and help advance Timor-Leste's further integration into the regional circle. With Manila at its helm, President Marcos said ASEAN will continue to promote dialogue, adherence to international law, and enhanced cooperation on traditional and non-traditional security issues. President Marcos said ASEAN centrality will be at the core of its initiatives in the coming year. President Marcos, meanwhile, commended Malaysia's pragmatic chairship over the past year, saying it steered the bloc with clarity and conviction. He said Manila will champion continuity and build upon the gains achieved by Malaysia in previous summits.
ASEAN is our ship, and 2026 will be the year when we set full sail together towards our shared horizon, guided by the theme, navigating our future together. The Philippines will continue to fortify our peace and security anchors, strengthen our prosperity corridors, and advance people empowerment. This reflects not just our aspirations, but our resolve to ensure that ASEAN's integration agenda translates into real opportunities for businesses to grow, for communities to thrive, and for progress to be inclusive, sustainable, and shared by all. For though the tides of change may be unpredictable, our compass must remain constant, anchored in cooperation. It must be oriented toward maintaining a stable and secure region, built upon a shared vision of an open, inclusive, transparent, and rules-based ASEAN regional architecture. We, as ASEAN, will stand firm as the institution that serves as the driving force behind the region's evolving landscape. Our goal is not to diverge from past chairships, but to build upon the collective work of our predecessors.
The three-day 47th ASEAN Summit and related meetings brought together world leaders from the 11 ASEAN member states and their dialogue partners, including U.S. President Donald Trump, Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae, Korean President Lee Jae-myung, Chinese Premier Li Qiang, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and New Zealand Prime Minister Christopher Luxon, to name a few. Among the milestones reached during the summit was the official admission of Timor-Leste as ASEAN's 11th member and the signing of the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement, or ACFTA 3.0 Upgrade Protocol.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. said corruption issues hounding the Philippines will not hamper the country's preparations in hosting the Association of Southeast Asian Nations or ASEAN Summit and related summits in 2026. In a media interview in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, President Marcos said domestic issues such as the alleged anomalies in flood control projects have no bearing on the country's ASEAN chairship next year. President Marcos noted that domestic issues concerning each member state do not matter in the decision-making of ASEAN. The president also said he is not in a position to influence his fellow ASEAN leaders on how to address corruption, saying each country has its own approach to dealing with the issue. He added that while he has been designated as the ASEAN chair for 2026, he could not imagine himself telling his fellow leaders what they should do to curb corruption. President Marcos nevertheless said the Philippines is ready to host the ASEAN Summit next year.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. condemned the continued foreign intrusions and hostilities in the West Philippine Sea or WPS, warning that these could endanger Filipinos. During his intervention at the 5th Association of Southeast Asian Nations or ASEAN Australia Summit in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, President Marcos stressed the need for an effective and substantive code of conduct or COC to prevent provocations at sea. President Marcos also criticized the unilateral, forceful, illegal attempts to declare Bajo de Masinloc or Scarborough Shoal a nature reserve. He maintained that Bajo de Masinloc remains a long-standing and integral part of the Philippines, emphasizing that the country exercises full sovereignty and jurisdiction over the territory. He said a binding COC can effectively govern the behavior of parties at sea. President Marcos also expressed gratitude to Australia for its proactive support for the Philippines through joint exercises such as Alon 25. Negotiations between China and ASEAN are ongoing to craft a COC, which is intended to serve as a framework for managing tension in the disputed South China Sea. During the 28th ASEAN-China Summit in Kuala Lumpur, President Marcos said partnerships between Beijing and the regional bloc must be rooted in mutual respect for sovereign equality and adherence to international law as guiding principles. President Marcos also renewed his call for self-restraint after raising concerns over persistent dangerous actions and harassment against Filipino fishermen and Philippine vessels in the WPS.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. said the Philippines is working to redefine its partnership with China, balancing the two states' cooperation while continuing to assert its rights and sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea. President Marcos indicated that the maritime law is not the sum total of the relations and that there is a huge possibility for trade exchanges and other kinds of discussions and engagements between China and the Philippines. Earlier in the 28th Association of Southeast Asian Nations or ASEAN-China Summit, President Marcos said Manila is open to exploring cooperative activities as well as mechanisms that would prevent risks of incidents in the South China Sea. At the same time, President Marcos said cooperation cannot exist alongside coercion, while calling out provocative and dangerous actions that put the lives of Filipino fishermen and sailors at risk at sea. He also mentioned Manila's rejection of the Chinese plan to put up a nature reserve in the Bajo de Masinloc or South China Sea. Meanwhile, he said the Philippines will invite Chinese President Xi Jinping to its hosting of the ASEAN next year. President Marcos was responding to a question about whether the Philippines aspires for Xi to be in Manila for the signing of the COC, assuming the negotiators finish the talks by 2026. If it comes to a point where Xi will consider coming to the Philippines, President Marcos said that would signal we have made significant progress in engaging China.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. expressed optimism over closer cooperation between the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, and Australia in economic, maritime, and climate initiatives ahead of the Philippines' 2026 chairship. President Marcos issued a statement as he recognized Australia's key role as ASEAN's first dialogue partner, standing with the regional bloc for over 5 decades in building a community of peace, stability, and people-centered prosperity. President Marcos said the Philippines, together with fellow Southeast Asian nations, is committed to the full and timely implementation of the ASEAN-Australia Plan of Action 2025 to 2029, a roadmap that reflects the trust and shared resolve underpinning their comprehensive strategic partnership. He lauded Australia's proactive engagement in ASEAN-led mechanisms and steadfast support for maritime cooperation and conflict prevention as vital pillars of shared stability. He said frameworks such as ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus or ADMM Plus and the expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum help expand channels of dialogue and strengthen collective capacity to safeguard the region's maritime domain. President Marcos also underscored the importance of the second protocol to amend the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Area or AANZ FTA in expanding market access, enhancing regulatory certainty, and creating new opportunities in e-commerce, sustainable trade, and micro, small, and medium enterprises or MSME development. He added that the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership or RCEP and the Regional Trade for Development or RT4D initiative would also serve as engines of deeper integration and inclusive growth. President Marcos also welcomed the establishment of the ASEAN Australia Center, emphasizing that its work in promoting Southeast Asia literacy, education, youth leadership, and cultural exchange will help shape the next generation of their relations. He also expressed appreciation for Australia's continued investment in climate resilience and marine protection, including the Climate and Clean Energy Window, which bolsters collective effort on climate change and clean energy.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. urged for increased ASEAN-New Zealand cooperation in trade, marine security, and sustainable development as the two countries celebrate 50 years of dialogue relations and upgrade their partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Speaking during the ASEAN-New Zealand Commemorative Summit in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, President Marcos commended New Zealand for its support for ASEAN centrality and underlined the necessity of collaboration under the 4 pillars of peace, prosperity, people, and the planet. On peace, he praised New Zealand's contribution to maritime cooperation, citing its support for ASEAN Regional Forum workshops on implementing the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea or UNCLOS. The President hailed the implementation of the second protocol to amend the ASEAN-Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Area or AANZ FTA, saying that it will increase market access, improve regulatory stability, and create new opportunities in commerce, or rather e-commerce, sustainable trade, and MSMEs. He urged ASEAN and New Zealand to strengthen their cooperation in sustainable agriculture and fisheries, highlighting New Zealand's experience in agri-tech and value chain integration as critical to improving food security in the face of climate and market pressures. President Marcos also praised New Zealand's scholarship initiatives, particularly the Manaki Scholarships and the Mindanao Young Leaders Program, which he said promote regional understanding and development of young Filipino leaders. Similarly, he emphasized New Zealand's commitment to the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity based in the Philippines and expressed hope for increased collaboration in conservation and environmental preservation. President Marcos reiterated the Philippines' support for the ASEAN-New Zealand Comprehensive Strategic Alliance and the proposed biannual ASEAN-New Zealand Summit, stating that they will elevate partnership to new heights for the benefit of the people. The meeting takes place as ASEAN attempts to improve trade and security relations amid geopolitical tensions and economic uncertainties in the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN member countries include Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. is seeking expanded cooperation on economic development with Vietnam and the United Nations. President Marcos expressed this intention in a bilateral meeting with United Nations or UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh on the sidelines of the 47th Association of Southeast Asian Nations or ASEAN Summit and related summits. President Marcos met with the Vietnamese leader and thanked Vietnam for its continued assistance to the Philippines during periods of drought and rice supply challenges. The Department of Foreign Affairs through the Presidential Communications Office said the two leaders expressed commitment to strengthen bilateral relations across government, economic, and security cooperation. They also highlighted interest in expanding economic diplomacy and enhancing bilateral strategic partnership. Meanwhile, in their meeting last Sunday, President Marcos and Guterres discussed key areas of cooperation, reaffirming their dedication to maintaining peace and stability, fostering economic growth, and ensuring social development and equality. President Marcos also said he looks forward to fostering bilateral cooperation and the UN's continued support to ASEAN and the ASEAN-UN framework. At the 15th ASEAN-UN Summit, President Marcos underscored the enhanced coordination across ASEAN and UN bodies in advancing inclusive and sustainable progress and pushed for a development agenda that leaves no one behind. He also pushed for the Philippines' bid for a non-permanent seat in the UN Security Council as he highlighted Manila's intensified efforts to uphold the rule of law and peaceful settlement of disputes. President Marcos said the Philippines' ratification of the Agreement on Marine Biological Diversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, or BBNJ agreement, solidified the Philippines' commitment to uphold the rules-based order government by international law, particularly the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea or UNCLOS. President Marcos said the Philippines remains committed to advancing the UN Sustainability Development Goals and called on ASEAN to fully harness its partnerships with the UN to accelerate meaningful progress.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. has called for the stronger implementation of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, to deepen integration as the world faces increasing economic and trade uncertainties. In his intervention at the 5th RCEP Summit in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, President Marcos underscored the need for parties to advance the accession process without delay. The deal entered into force for Australia, Brunei, Cambodia, China, Japan, Laos, New Zealand, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines between 2022 to 2023. India withdrew from RCEP negotiations in November 2019, but the participating countries' leaders endorsed a declaration saying that India may commence RCEP or RCEP accession negotiations at any time. President Marcos said RCEP, as the world's largest free trade agreement, would provide a stable and predictable framework for trade and investments. During the summit, the leaders reaffirmed their commitment to upholding an open, inclusive, and rules-based multilateral trading system. In the joint statement, the leaders instructed their ministers to narrow the gap of implementation, particularly for the less developed economies, and address longer-term emerging challenges such as climate change, digital transformation, and supply chain vulnerabilities. The parties are set to conduct a general review of the agreement in 2027 and continue discussions on ways to accelerate its implementation. The 5th RCEP Summit was the first leaders' meeting since the RCEP agreement entered into force in 2022. Department of Trade and Industry or DTI Secretary Cristina Roque, who accompanied President Marcos in the regional event said the Philippines can achieve greater economic progress, broader opportunities, and shared prosperity by working closely with free trade agreement partners. The DTI said that trade with ASEAN member accounted for 47.7% of the Philippines' exports in 2024 and 71.9% for imports. On top of trade, it said the RCEP boosts the digital economy, supply chain, connectivity, competition and consumer protection, green economy, and energy materials.
We took this opportunity to also really strengthen the ties between the ASEAN countries, the different ASEAN countries, and the Philippines. We also spoke about strengthening trade in particular, no, and also how we can really bond together as ASEAN countries so that we can really strengthen the ties among each other. So maganda po yung naging outcome nito. And aside from that, we also discussed the different free trade agreements that we can do on a bilateral basis, no, between the Philippines and the different countries. So maganda rin po ito kasi pag bilateral, it's really just the two countries. So we can really talk extensively on what products and on what areas where we can really strengthen our trade. So maganda po yung naging feedback and maganda po yung naging outcome ng ating mga meeting. And the President also told them that the Philippines is very eager for foreign investors and foreign investments kasi this not only gives income to our country but also provides jobs. So sa lahat ng mga countries na may investments na po sa atin, the President also reiterated to them that we will protect and we will take care of their investors in our country. So maganda po yung naging outcome nito. So we look forward to actually continuing the ties between the different ASEAN countries and the Philippines.
Department of Trade and Industry, DTI Secretary Cristina Roque.
Dateline Malacañang.
And that is all for today's Dateline Malacañang. For Radyo Pilipinas World Service, this has been Bea Gaza-de Guzman.
From the Presidential Palace, Manila, Dateline Malacañang.